Hi, and welcome to another episode of Radio Free Golgotha.
Hello.
That's Al. He's British.
Hiya.
On some days, every second Tuesday, he's American.
Oh,
We're all American here, Al.
it's America. All right, California Uber Alex. This is Jesse.
Fox Americana. Okay. Yes. Hello. We are recording from the secret rat cave location in honor of the good Saint Cyprian, which many people have been asking, when are we doing a Cyprian episode? Lo and behold, on his feast day. It's funny that we're still getting the hang of things last year, and now we are saving our Cyprian load for today. So it is a big old feast of black magic in small compact packages, depending on how long we have. But this is a conversation starter, not ever meant to be authoritarian, except that we're right and you're wrong.
As is tradition.
In accordance with the prophecy, which is, of course, all bullshit. So it's actually a question we get a lot on the folk necromancy group of like, what exactly is the prophecy? And if you don't know, if you have to ask. Anyway, so why don't you tell people what today's episode is brought to you by, brought to us by, them by, I don't know.
Well, it's brought to you by us, waving you a very merry Cyprianmas, and indeed a Justinamas, perhaps as well. It is
The Autistismus.
Yeah. It is brought to you by the Saint Cyprian, obviously, the demon Hael, and the Exu of Quimbanda, Exu Meia Noite, and the plant Asafoetida, if I say that in a manner that I think is right.
Asafoetida.
Yeah, right. The
Asafoetida.
devil's tongue.
Yeah, devil's dung. Asafoetida is how I know it.
It's also brought to you by the stone jet, or gigantes, as it's also sometimes known. Or
Lignite.
Yeah,
Black amber. It's another fun name.
Well, it was also brought to you by the genre of magic, or the magic of books, of grimoires, and of Liber Spiriti, or Liber Spiritums, if you want to do an English pluralization. And indeed the geomantic figure of Cauda Draconis, the dragon's tail, and the corresponding Odu Ogunda, and the tarot card of the Magician.
Who's our dead magician now?
It's a Cyprian as well. It's both the Cyprians, arguably. There we go. Or Cyprian, as he's even sometimes written.
Lazy.
Occasionally.
Lazy combining all these topics.
Where it's a supercharged extra focus.
All those people are like, that 3-hour episode was way too long. It's time that you just do a 30-minute episode and combine everything to just being about Cyprian.
So this is hopefully coming to you on the 26th of September, which is no longer the 7th month, despite its name, Trixie month. And it is a feast of Cyprian and of Justina, who is arguably the power behind the, don't call it a throne, the savior, the virgin martyr who redeems Cyprian. And it is a redemption story.
And we do just as well to mention that this is also the feast of Cosme and Damian.
That's also true. It's also true because they're twinsies. That they get two, which makes sense to me at least. And they are conveniently one after the other. So they're also served on the 27th. I would love to them next year and really go in depth with them. They're great doctors, the divine physicians. In having just finished teaching a course on the 4th book of occult philosophy and talking about the Isagoge, the treatise on the nature of spirits. That's one of the texts included in that compilation that gets called the 4th book. The dialogue on this conversation that Pictorius frames as a dialogue between the twins Castor and Pollux also got me thinking about twinsy stuff as well in a couple ways. And the fact that there are two of them and then the third is Helen. And it's said that that's because they both come from Zeus, and the idea is that the guy framing this rather dry treatise about what spirits are and what they aren't and what you can do with them and what you can't isn't really interested in fleshing them out as characters, but wants just to have two voices that are talking to each other. Wow, I've tangented already massively.
Why not?
Okay, all right. Long walks and short tangents. Brilliant. So what do you think then, as a broader question? We talk about saints on their saint days, and we talked a fair bit about what that is in terms of a ritual calendar and how that helps orient us in time, as well as, I guess, space in terms of specific churches and things like that, or the domains that a saint might rule.
The green, purple, red, white of the Catholic liturgical calendar.
So how do you think Cosmo and Damian and devotion to them, or a veneration of them, or a marking them in the year, affects a Cyprian and Justina centered approach, and vice versa?
I've thought a lot about that with just because the twinsies, the having two, a polarity there. And Cyprian and Justina certainly represent a similar polarity in the practice around the world of Justina being this figure of sanctity and the converting force for the dark Cyprian to come over to the blue side of the force. And also the idea that he retains it. And he's kind of trapped in his pre-conversion days in a lot of people's heads of being the powerhouse there, that maybe he never gave it up. Some versions of it, he burns the books as soon as he converts. Other versions, he never burns it, or some he eats them. Like, it depends on which part of the world you're in.
Or literally gives them out to kids.
Yeah, like St. Nicholas, like, here, you get a grimoire, you get a grimoire, you get a grimoire.
Is your fascination with my forbidden closet of mystery?
Yes, exactly, we could have done a fool on that one. But the connection there too, I remember this discussion long ago, back in the late mid-90s. Wow. Over 20 years ago, before my college days, discussing with a circle of magical friends about the tides of the year and what the equinoxes do and how difficult equinoxes are. But equinoxes, the equality of day and light, and brings up questions of polarity and twins and day, night, male, female, hot, cold, this especially this kind of graded polarity, diametrically opposed Manichaean split that is heavily informing Indo-European Western culture. And so there's something there that they're both interestingly around the equinox there. And that earlier in the year during the spring equinox, you have Jesus' resurrection, which you also have Lady Day. And you have the earth is waking up, but Jesus then is wedded to the earth by going into it. He's penetrating the earth through death. That being hung on the tree allows him to enter hell and come back out. And that going into the cave and coming back out, that there's also this weirdly sexual metaphor. The piercing, Jesus becomes the woman who is pierced by the sword of Longinus. So there's a lot of interesting polarities that are happening there as spring and fall. And that traditionally, yes, fairy activity, you have May Day and Salve, which means November. People just going to be picky there. But Hallows and May Day of being fairy times extreme, but that ghost activity, poltergeist activity is heavily connected to the equinoxes and the kind of phenomenology of those events, of the weirdness, because it means the world is changing dramatically. We've gone from one extreme, which we can define, pure darkness, to another extreme that is pure light. Very few people celebrate the half moon. It's not like, ooh, what moon is it tonight? Something gibbous, it's something or other. And this idea too that, the equinoxes are not as celebrated worldwide as actual significant things. You just realize that it's growing still. So it's to celebrate the equinox, which is an astronomical event, is a much more difficult calculation than just going, well, the sun's not moving any further left or right. So we figured out the cap. We planted that tree 20 years ago and the sun is not moving any more than that tree. So, it's an interesting side of that. But I think the polarity side of that draws into question there for Cosme Damian, for Cyprian and Justina, who are celebrated together. The only references I find to that May date of Cyprian, he's mentioned alone, not as Cyprian and Justina. So I find that interesting as well. And there's the thing that we have to bring up, of course, in talking about Cyprian is the convergence of Cyprian of Carthage and Cyprian of Antioch, that we know Cyprian of Carthage existed, or at least we have historical records referencing him. Yeah. Oh my God, you're using our own book as cheat sheets. It's like a different kind of cheat. You said that once. Notes are, smart cheating. But the idea that Cyprian of Carthage, who is a doctor of the church, who is mentioned in the Litany of Saints in the start of a 6-candle mass, that as happens throughout Catholic history, in practice, if that's your saint and you don't know that it's Saint Cyprian of Carthage, you're like, yay, sorcery! Right. It's, I remember my classics teacher in college, Peter Meineck, was talking about the structure of the Iliad and the Odyssey, like when those long lists of, and this town was here. And he's like, in oral poetry, it's not recited from memory in that way. It's checking who's in the room. It's like, it's like, good night, Athens. How are we doing tonight? Right. Who's from Attica? And you're like, yay! So there's something there of just the lists of these saints, of everybody's patron saints, the figures, the churches, making sure that it's relative to people and identifiable to people. But the doctor of Carthage is a doctor of the church. This is, a title that's not given out easily. It is an ancient saint, and most churches that are named for Cyprian are indeed named for Cyprian of Carthage, not Cyprian of Antioch.
It's not just the name, right? On the one hand, you could say, one of them was the cool pagan street sorcerer handing out, astral roofies and sending demons after people. And the other one was the boring one that is a church father and he's referred to as always talking about God quite a few times, seeking to and thinking of God. But what that results in, how that's portrayed, is as a book again, is as a church father who wrote a lot of stuff and wrote doctrine and explored.
And the doctors of the church are people who write doctrine,
Right.
Not just, medics.
Right.
So then you get the icon itself, the lithograph that most people are familiar with, the statues are of Cyprian of Carthage, which conveniently or inconveniently is celebrated September 16th. And there is a tradition in borderland southwestern United States and northern Mexico, and I'm sure into central Mexico as well. But Dias de los Ciprianos happens. That is, there's 10 days. So if you start at sundown on the 16th, celebrating St. Cyprian of Carthage, you're now building the way up for Cyprian of Antioch. And this basically means that it's over a week-long celebration of the Cyprianness of things without worrying about which saint is which. This kind of outside in, and it always seems to be bishops and non-Catholics. Note the similarities of the people that argue against common practice of like, that Lazarus is not the other Lazarus. You should not be conflating the two, or that type of thing. You're like, okay, fuck off. He's still healed my grandma of cancer, so I don't care what you say.
And both repel deep.
Yes.
Like they both do. Referred to as Cyprian the martyr as well, and Cyprian the doctor specifically, who was ever talking and meditating upon God. That's what Father Michaelis says in his admirable history. So they're already linked. It's not just, we heard that Cyprian from one of them had this thing about demonology and about counter magic. No, they both do, but from very different angles.
Which brings up an interesting point about saints too, that in the early days of the church, most saint stories were extremely similar. You had to be a martyr originally for the holy dead that was there imitating Christ even in your death. And that there could be a thing here of like the Homeric shout outs that saints weren't necessarily about their individual stories because their stories were so similar, but about their locations, and that my town had this martyr and I do that. And eventually there's this adaptation, especially after the Golden Legend, where people are learning about saints that are nowhere near them. And so saints, the relics, the trade and the trafficking and the fraudulent practice of relics in the Middle Ages, which was a huge booming business, taking pieces of the Holy Land with you and pieces of Holy Landers home with you, or conveniently, I found bones in a cave, it must be a saint.
Or getting tattooed, putting ink under the skin despite
the Leviticus,
the rulings against it, so that you can come back and say,
someone who likes a man who likes man, I support this ignoring of Leviticus. Shrimp and bacon are good. Yeah, so I think that there's something different in the modern perspective too of saints, that we choose our patron saints, we choose one for our confirmation names, as opposed to familial names. Like I know in my family, in many Hispanic families, your confirmation name is limited because it has to be from naming patterns within the family. So you don't get the broad picture book of saints that was published in the 60s handed to you and go like, which one do you like?
Right.
And always being told, I wanted to name myself for an angel. And they're like, that's not you need a dead person. It's like, whoa, this is truly like some bone licking necromantic stuff.
So you picked a dead person who was named after you.
Yes, exactly right. Who is actually about my great uncle. So I have the Muslim angel.
Also the geomancing angel, the angel of geomancy.
I love this show about me. This is great. But okay, so we have this conflation between Cyprian and Cyprian,
which is not a confusion as well, often framed as, I feel that there's a little implicit, like, they weren't half idiots in the past thing. And I don't think it's that there was a mistake that no one rectified.
No, I think also the history of saints in the early church, it's almost like people are always saying that the church has this devious plan. Yes, it's about power and land, but it's not like there's our villainous movie plot in my head. It's like, this is like when people say like the whole world is plotting against me. Most of the world doesn't care about you. So they're not plotting against you. It's things happen and they get used. And someone has a devotion to this figure of a pagan magician who is converted by a Christian woman, or converted to a different lifestyle at least, which is a Beauty and the Beast story, as was talked about heavily in Cipriano Old World. Pick up your copies, Revelor Press. So the Thecla story, there's other motifs of what this is. It is, in the catalog of folk story.
Yeah, it falls within a kind of genre, both in terms of hagiographies sharing their particular beats, but also in terms of working off earlier story formats.
Yes.
So not just the specific tropes or story beats or scenes, but also the construction, the 3-act structure, for instance. The 3 acts of Paul and Thecla structure.
Yeah. There's a lot of things going on. I mean, what would an episode be without a rat drinking from the water bottle? So just mentioning it now, that's what that sound is.
Rat cave.
Yeah. The other side of it too, that Justina goes through waves of popularity and then kind of pushed to the side again. And Cyprian keeps coming to the fore. Certainly the Black Book tradition does not seem to include mention of Justina much at all.
No, which I guess kind of makes sense in terms of, if we think about the myth cycle, he seems to be worked or referenced both pre-conversion and post-conversion. But certainly if you're going to
Time as an illusion.
do a Black Book, then which is also a kind of twinsies, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to do a Black Book, then it's going to make more sense that you want the demon names and the rocket fuel and the forbidden things.
You don't want just the invitation, you want the actualization. And so Justina goes through, I mean, arguably theologians and priests in homilies that are recorded back through the 1500s are always emphasizing Justina as the important emphasis thing there, because it's the conversion. And I think of the Brazilian statue of Saint Cyprian, which is so interesting because it shows him in the penitent pose, converting to falling to his knees because his evil rape magic does not, through which is Belial, is the named.
I mean, as a son of darkness or as a worthless one, there's certainly become references, but not in the earlier texts. No, that first demon has a heck of a CV. I think it claims to have tempted Adam and Eve. I think it claims to have invented spiky plants at all. I think
all the Torahs belong to me.
Right. To have taught sin. It gives this great CV.
I find it very interesting that, like, in the popular myths of Cyprian that arise, especially in Latin America, where because of the Book of Saint Cyprian arising and being so popular in northern Spain and therefore all over Iberia and its distribution into the New World, Saint Cyprian is all over Latin America and becomes incorporated into Afro-diasporic traditions and things like that. So the myths of Cyprian is like, I remember I think the first time I remember hearing the name Belial was in connection to him being the demon that Cyprian hired to go take Justina. Just because I've remembered that for 30 years doesn't mean that's what the historical accounts say.
No. I mean, those are historical accounts as well.
That's true.
That's kind of the point, right? But the translation.
My bad memory is history. This is true.
Yeah. It's a story about history, which is also incorporated. It is also like the Borg. No, the demon isn't mentioned specifically, but the acts are, and by extension, then there's a notion that, like, if we have the name of whoever did the teaching Cain to slay his brother, the rising up of thorns and thistles, the demon that prepares adultery, that teaches people to make their bull and to throw down Christ to be sacrificed, or even to just divide homes into, or shake cities, or deceive Eve.
Then you still get connections then from even that list of CV for things that are attributed to Baal, to Belial, to Ashmedai, to various toppling of empire, to pushing Jesus down, to all these things that are always pseudo-canonical because it's grimoires or oral stories or things like that. It is a hard thing too, that because of the Cyprianic revival in the Anglosphere that has happened, and which has also fueled a revival in the Spanish sphere, the Latin American sphere as well, because there's more literature being and discussions happening. So you get an increased amount of iconography, of representations, of people talking about this, of interest in it, and therefore it spurs the interest back into rare print manuscripts. And you saw prices jump of books, the books of Saint Cyprian, which come in different colors in Brazil, after even the publication of a few books on Cyprian recently. All of a sudden those things go skyrocketing because like, well, you could have got it for $200 a while back, but now it's to $2,000 because this is the hardest to find one, people fighting over which color cover is the one that you should have. And
do you have any recommendations for?
Oh, I'm not sharing that.
Oh, there we go. How about we into it?
It's one of them. I have 7 of them. No, but also, we have to applaud Letao and Maggie for their work on translating a lot of these things.
Oh, sure.
To know also that, I have friends that say, oh, have you read the Book of Saint Cyprian? And the question is always, which one? Because the Heptameron is clearly called the Book of Saint Cyprian in many Botanica, like those penny pamphlets you get. So the concept of what is a Book of Cyprian, and we've talked about this in a larger context, talking about it of both of us in various lectures we've done, and a continuing thing that like any book of magic gets known as, when a prominent book of magic is written, the author's name can be lent to anything. The 4th book of Agrippa is pseudo Agrippa,
right?
But isn't Agrippa. And therefore, all books of magic at that time that are published, well, that must be in Agrippa.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it becomes, it's like the Xeroxing of things or the Googling of things, which, as your wife once explained to me, is death for the product, because now people don't have to have brand loyalty. And it's just like, oh, well, I have a Xerox on my Canon copying machine.
When things get verbed.
Yeah, it's death for business, but good for everybody that's not the mother company.
Yeah.
But this also means that Cyprian becomes a reference, not necessarily. And if you look at the books of Cyprian as to what they are, it's a collection of folk magic. It's not a consistent narrative or a system. This is why the Heptameron version is actually interesting, because Heptameron is actually a mini system that you can incorporate. It's still...
Sure, and you get two things called the Heptameron as well, if we're going to talk twinsies. You get the thing that is also known as the magical elements of Peter Debano, but you also get the Heptameron of Cyprian, which is not that. And
both have been called the Book of Saint Cipriano.
Yeah.
Probably because someone said, oh, it's the Heptameron. Yeah, I have that.
Yeah. And it's something to do on every day of the week.
Yeah. And strangely incomplete invocations in some of the versions of them, of like a lot of ampersands and like cutting off halfway through, or like a lot of bad translations into whatever the common tongue is.
Yeah. And the instructions certainly in the magical elements of Peter Debano, a lot of the instructions stay in Latin. It's been in English, and then it gives a Latin conjuration, but then it continues in Latin to say like, oh, this is where, you know, shit gets crazy. This is where, you know, the spiritual...
What's the Latin for shit?
And there's a couple. I mean, Sturcus, you can use.
And just, you know, I'm a cloaca fan, but that's not the word for shit.
But it's the sewer though, right?
It's sewer and a chicken butt. Guess what? Cloaca.
Butt Street.
Okay, so if we go on that, which is interesting because you can see how our topics are very well chosen today. But the concept of a magic book I will use the very Mexican term Cipriano, which is the name of the book. Is some people call them other things. I always get confused when I can't tell if someone's making something up. Cipriani, I'm like, this isn't a restaurant. But the Ciprianios are so varied in what they are that it is a notebook. It is basically like your collection, and it's under the patronage with the stamp on the front of like a prayer to Cyprian, of being the patron of magical books, of being the saint that had magic books and therefore can protect you from the prying eyes of the church coming into you and saying like, no, this is saint magic.
Right.
And the understanding too that like the church's attitude and local attitudes towards manipulation of saints towards magical ends is a tricky subject, and always suspect to the local authority as to, you know, have you put something other than just candles and flowers to a saint, you're working magic. And like the idea that praying to Saint Christopher to bring your lover back because you put hair next to the candle, that's witchcraft. But just offering a candle and praying for that is not the same. That's not witchcraft. And so it becomes this, especially in Latin America, because of the Inquisition here, you get a lot of case records where people were reported for witchcraft and the bishop was like, I'm one bishop and you're 700 miles away. That person's not doing witchcraft. Fuck that case. I'm not going there for that. I'm not going to the backwoods of Nuevo Mexico up there to try someone for trying to get their cow to make more milk. I'm not doing that. That's not what I want. If the person has property that I can seize and add to my own church, then I'll go.
Right. An economic imperative.
Choices.
I wonder if we see the same mechanics going on, because we definitely see parallel tradition, if we like, or certainly practice of attributing a particular collection or a couple of particular collections, or the general notion of collecting recipes together into a book in the Ciprianos or the Cipriani of, you know, a variety of Northern European places. And I'm thinking here particularly, I pulled this book out of my bag, the Mary S. Rustad's Black Books of Elverum, which gives us a take on the Norwegian Black Books tradition, where the whole book is set. You're right. Black art books, right?
Which always makes me think is like naughty photography.
that would be Bloom.
Well, yes, I guess that's true.
The whole book is said to be a Cyprianus, and there are no specific invocations or even references to Cyprian, but all of these things, from how to add human bone to your gunpowder to be able to shoot animals more accurately, to how to get rid of toothache, to a variety of other things, are all considered under his aegis. And that's interesting that I don't think there are a lot of the same actual spells. It's not like they're coming from one Cyprian text that split off into Iberia and Norway. But there is this sense of like, oh, he's the book magic guy. And so, of course, you stamp that on the front. As you say, both for reasons of respectability politics, and also as the
Especially when you start being able to sell them.
Right. Right.
Those frontispieces of those books, there's some of them are just, that frontispiece is then just taken out of one book and put in the front of another, and you have the volume.
And even when it's a specific collection, as we get with De Necromancia, which we have at least 2 copies of, in terms of a Sloane manuscript in Latin and an English one in the collection of edition manuscript 366.
I just wish it wasn't an old English fonted one.
Oh gosh, yes, the heptangle Michael Albion MacDonald, I think 1987. Yes, a headache to actually physically read, which perhaps is part of its dark curse. But even that text, right, is said to be the experiments of Roger Bacon and a certain Turk that he was doing work with in Brasenose College. Al-Hazred. So right. So there's an author of the person that wrote the thing physically, but even then, the patronage of the magic itself is said to be Cyprian's.
Which fits into the story that Draconis too, that it was a German monk that Cyprian appeared to and said, "My book was destroyed. I need you to write this down." And that the man goes mad and in various versions kills himself, destroys the book again, and it magically keeps reappearing in the monkery. And it's just like, oh God, get rid of it.
So never die.
But I think there's this interesting thing too, if we're going to keep, because obviously Cyprian could be a very long episode for us. It's been a passion of both of ours and a dispassion of mine as well. Just get tired of it sometimes, right? Not of Cyprian, but of fads and magic, right? Of like something that is, it's the hipster impulse. I'm just saying I'm a hipster, apparently. But like everything, like Justina's waves of popularity, and it's interesting when you get a populace that is not as familiar with certain aspects of Cyprian tradition, decrying something that is a genuine Cyprian tradition because it doesn't look like what they know.
Right. We've talked about this before, the danger, not just in terms of the arrogance of having, put even a year's worth of research or effort into something and then, claiming expertise and teaching it, because when you bump up against something you don't know, there's a worrying possibility that you might end up making the whole field that you proclaim to love narrower because you don't recognize it. So it can't be a real thing. So you actually end up doing a disservice to the tradition and to the people practicing it by doing that.
And also with Cyprian, because it's such an inspirational story that we, at this point, we are very well aware that there is a huge conflation with Cyprian of Carthage. Playing on that, we are very well aware that there is probably no historical Cyprian and Justina, that it is a continuation of devices. But from the other side of it, none of those saints are historical in the sense that you never knew any of them. This is like, I love the discussion in a ritual studies class in college. We watch Princess Di's funeral and people are weeping. She's like, so who is this woman to you? You don't know her. You don't know her at all. You've only ever known her through media. So why is this so real for you? And the question goes in that lovely chaos magic way of like, does it matter? If you're getting something from the story, is it a spirit? I mean, the idea that any spirit can appear as whatever it wants, even if we take it from a pure side and not deception, that one of the Buddha bodies is to be able to appear exactly as to what the person needs to be able to understand the message that needs to be delivered. So that you appear in the form that is most pleasing to the person's communicative problems. To bypass those certain things. So if I need to come to you as the Virgin Mary, I will come to you as the Virgin Mary. If I'm trying to deceive you and get offerings because, it's me, I'm your grandma, and it's the wolf for a little wedding, that can happen too. I don't know. It reminds me of a conversation I just had with someone when talking about details of possession, and his talk about it was like, it's the people that never get possessed that certainly like to talk about all the details of possession. And similarly, people that don't deal with spirits a lot like to talk about all the matters in which spirits can come. And it's like, sometimes it's just like, just put the offering out, and is your life getting better? Then keep doing it. Angel or God, whatever it may be, which is the lovely heresy in Cyprian, which, I think that's a interesting side with heresy because it ties heavily into Meia Noite, because I'm realizing we can spend hours talking about Cyprian, but at some point we've got to insert these other topics too.
Oh, yeah. And we've been meditating around other saints and even spirits, one might say, attached around him. So that feels very apt. So what can we say about Mr. Midnight?
Well, the connection here for those that know and don't know is Meia Noite is the teacher of Saint Cyprian in Brazilian tradition. Since the advent of Quimbanda being named as such after the creation of Umbanda, or the codification of Umbanda by Moraes in the early 20th century, its roots go back further than that for both of those traditions, of course. But the spirit known as Mr. Midnight is said to be the teacher of Cyprian. And Exu Meia Noite's lore is pretty intense and developed, and is a kind of as we joked around earlier, the evil librarian Eshu. This is the spirit that is one of the generals of Omulu, of death. It is the darkness of death. So death manifests and organizes its legions through Exu Caveira and Exu Meia Noite. The line of souls is organized through those two generals. And Caveira is the physical remains of death, and Meia Noite is the darkness of death. What happens when you close your eyes and you are going into blackness? As such, he is the blackening of anything, and he's heavily tied to the eclipse at Jesus' death, the darkness from the 6th to the 9th hour, the rending of the veil where the Shekhinah comes out, and the kind of democratization of God power amongst the planet, which is also interesting because when Jesus dies, there's no God on earth. So you get the Salve de Gloria, the Holy Saturday where Jesus is gone. And this is interesting because that's when new Catholic converts are brought in. They're brought in during a place where there is no Jesus. So the first point where they receive the Mass as a Christian is on Easter morning when God comes back to earth, resurrected out of the earth, that they are in the darkness being born again. Yeah. And that kind of Santo Entierro mythology that goes with that, Jesus, the body of Jesus that's there, Meia Noite ties into that, and that he steals the breath of God, this last breath that comes out because it is the darkness that is over everything, and distributes it amongst the Eshus. And so Jesus is bringing the good pagans out of hell after his death, but Meia Noite is distributing the breath of God into hell. He is organizing his own communion. Meia Noite has a lot of ties to Catholic imagery. It's one of the few Eshus that really likes bells and rosaries and things like that, because all is power. So you get the concept of heresy. There's no such thing as blasphemy, just different forms of power. The only blasphemy is to say that there's no such thing as divinity or spirit. Everything past that, Meia Noite grabs. And the idea that you have the relationship between light and darkness there, that polarity of like it's dark when it should be light. We're talking about midnight, that wherever he comes, it's midnight, the blackening of the sky and the blackening of the page with ink. So Meia Noite becomes very tied into transmission of knowledge, just like the Shekhinah coming out, and the how do you read a page, but the eclipse upon it, and the eclipsing of it with ink. And I think that ties into lore with Cyprian, even up in Mexico, where there's no mention of Exu Meia Noite, but Cyprian is described as the saint who bleeds ink. And this outpouring then ties into local myths of Cyprian eating his books, of like, they're not in my house, they're not here, but knowing that if he eats them, he will have ingested that knowledge, which is then a communion, which you've made your spirit book, your Liber Spirituae, it becomes a blasphemous host.
Oh, and yeah, and there's a long running textual amulet tradition of doing exactly that, or of washing.
Was it pica? And you eat things that you're not supposed to?
Yeah. And that's often the term given to, pregnant ladies that start eating clay and things like that. But the point being, not that they're not meant to, but actually often there is some mineral benefit, yes, to doing that. Listening to the body is helpful, despite the cultural context.
Keep your appendix; it'll help you digest grimoires.
There's definitely traditions of washing, say the gospel. The idea of, in the beginning, there was the word. The word is so important. The word is written on this page. I'm going to wash the ink off this page and use that for something.
Yes.
Or I'm going to take that actual page and fold it up real small and put it in a thing. We're familiar with that, written charms. But the idea of manipulating the ink of written charms and of the page of them.
And certainly in parchment era, where you have the concept of virgin parchment being that it's never been written on a part, because you can write a Bible passage on a parchment and then wash the parchment and the ink will be in whatever you put it in. So if you're drawing a pentacle in a certain hour, it can be sat in water and you can rub the ink off, and the skin can be used for whatever you want after, which is the whole notion of virgin parchment, of this should not have touched ink before. Not that it hasn't had its hymen broken, but I find all that, the eating of ink, the squidding of magic. I'm a squid person by nature. Al's more of an octopus person by nature. Octopi are probably octopuses. Actually, I think you corrected me on that, right? It's octopuses.
I mean, they're all valid.
Don't say that. Don't say that. There are not 8 ways to skin a cat, Al.
Octopuses is arguably that.
Octopodes.
Octopodes is pretty much only used in descriptions of its own lack of use.
If you ever want to change the conversation topic, mention octopuses.
Well, most of them are, pretty solitary in nature anyway.
You ain't an octopus for more.
Clearly.
You digested Wikipedia.
What I like about octopuses and ink in this particular context is the idea of the pseudomorph. Of spitting ink, not just as a cloud that obscures thing, but making a double of yourself that fools someone so that you can dissipate. The ink jet blanch maneuver of spitting something with a high mucus content that looks vaguely octopus-like or squid-like, then changing color rapidly and then jetting and then legging it, ape-legging it.
Which you make me think of is the heptapods in arrival of not necessarily to duplicate themselves, but to duplicate a language is a duplication of self. You're duplicating a thought that you have trying to convey. So this idea of written language in that way, quite interesting, like the ink gets manipulated.
And their own kind of magic circle.
Yeah.
Heptapods, peptamerons, sevens upon sevens upon sevens.
In the 7th month, it is not 7.
Yeah.
The 7th month, it is 9. How appropriate for Quimbanda then. So Meia Noite has a lot of stories about him. There are many things that he does. He's one of the leaders of the line of souls. There's magic ascribed to him. He is very heavily tied to the nature of the torturing magic that is listed in the Book of St. Cyprian in Latin America, the black cat, bone, spell, torturing of animals. In this way, I'm not saying that that's the only thing Meia Noite does, but the magic ascribed to Cyprian in Brazil gets very heavily tied to Meia Noite, who is considered to be a wonderful advisor, but he lacks the humor of some other Exus and is disciplined and stricture, which the Das Almas line generally is. His personal story in that kind of umbandista, like he must have been a physical person first, is that he was a baron that lived in Minas Gerais and was married to a young girl. And when he had sex with her on the wedding night, she didn't bleed, so she wasn't a virgin. And he went and killed the whole family. And didn't kill her, killed her whole family for telling him that she was a virgin when she wasn't. And then she delivers his baby and takes her back in. And there's just different divergent stories from there. He's always a dick. But the reason I bring that up is that not only is Meia Noite viewed as being a not nice person in his life, that is then working off that negative karma in an umbandist kind of perspective from Quimbanda de Raiz. This is less important than the fact that he's not working on it. His nature is tied into this blackness, this death concept that is there. But that in Latin America specifically, those who work with Cyprian have a certain reputation. Cyprian himself is not considered a nice saint. He has an almost humorless saint. And this is because if you look at the books of magic ascribed to him, none of this is lovely magic. No. It's incredibly, this is the kind of, I think anybody who works with plants long enough realizes that herbalism is not that nice either, but there's this lore of it being, you're in touch with the earth and there's this kind of hippie-ish mirage of it, but you're ripping plants apart for their blood and killing things as well as planting things. But it's very engaged with natural cycles, which isn't necessarily pretty. And Cyprian there's no differentiation between plant, animal, and mineral. It's all ingredient to get you what you want. And that side of it, of supplanting compassion for or caretakerness of the earth and putting that to God and saying, let God figure that out. I am becoming commander of this thing. Cyprian's children, people who work with Cyprian, are not usually considered to be nice people. The saint does not encourage niceness. This is why the balance with Justina in the curanderismo traditions in Mexico and even Peru that work. Not that Peru heavily does anything with Justina. Cyprian is a median point between the right and the left sides of the mesa, but that there needs to be something else that grounds you, which in Quimbanda we would say kind of mayoral concept, but that in Mexico, Justina is necessary to kind of balance out the
capillary.
Yeah. The concupiscence that's going to happen, this darkening of the soul, constantly Catholic concupiscence there. I don't understand Protestant concupiscence, but how to not be a dick. And a lot of experience with Meia Noite children in Quimbanda. And there are a lot of common lack or a thing of taking oneself too seriously. And especially the people that are attracted to Meia Noite and Cyprian work. It is actually seems to me like I've seen a lot of fights in the Cyprian groups as of like, no, this is the one thing. It becomes this thing of like, oh, okay. If we all spend time doing our magic as opposed to fighting on Facebook, I guess that's the mantra for this podcast sometimes, is stay off Facebook, except the folk necromancy group, because we heavily moderate it. Meia Noite is syncretized with Hael. Or associated with Hael. Syncretization is a weird thing. There are puntos to Meia Noite that actually refer to him as Hael de Meia Noite, which is interesting. Hael of midnight, but still talk about him as an Exu. So seed, the fluor, the desk, and the somewhat increasing temperatured room to what ties Hael in, other than the Cyprian with Meia Noite thing. How does Hael fit into this constellation of Cyprianity?
Oh, sure. Well, for a start, the structures are very, very similar, and it seems that we don't just counterpart individual spirits, but we also counterpart their hierarchical arrangement as it's found in, as we now know, the Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis, which later, becomes the Verum. So again, Hael is a counterpart to Sergalath, and both have rulership of 8 underspirits.
Just so you made me think of in talking about Solomon there, like another patron of books of magic. That's just like, it's a biblical figure that Victor, something that controls demons. And therefore it's great to ascribe any magical book to him.
Right. His wisdom is God-given. And that wisdom is the wisdom of the stars, the plants, the stones, the metals. That he's also specifically trapping spirits and
Fathering spirits.
Fathering them, being replaced by one for a hot minute before he treks all the way back and kicks the guy in his skin out or in his shape out.
So similar, we have not a book of Solomon, but books. Similarly to Book of Cyprian, but it is Books of Cyprian, which all of this is, we're talking about, people talk about Solomonic tradition or Cyprianic tradition. It is not a monolith. It is traditions that have convergent evolution. Is that what it is? When there's a source, because it's a biblical or a saint, whatever your lore is, it's going to arise in different continents. But okay, so going back to Hael and the organization as of the Verum.
Yeah. So we have Hael ultimately under Astaroth in the Verum construct, which is interesting because that's one of the few chiefs, the three chiefs in the LBA rather than the LBS system that actually turns up in any of these Cyprianus collections that we find in Northern Europe. That's one of the few names. I mean, you get, Lucifer turns up a fair bit and Beelzebub turns up, but Astaroth is the one that seems to, and versions of that name that seem to crop up more regularly, which is, again, tied back to, the Testament and other forms of Asherah and informs a bunch of conversations about where it is that a deletion job is done, a hatchet job is done on the wife of God, and those kinds of conversations that have been gone into in far more detail. Hael himself is specifically around writing, around letters, and by extension, that letters, that characters, starts to mean seals and sigils and glyphs, and also the understanding of them. So crucially, the idea of teaching and transmission and reception. And certainly in practice, when you talk to people that are actually working with this spirit, the emphasis is heavily on ink. And that was certainly my experience long before I knew anything about Quimbanda, was that Hael stood forth as one who would help consecrate the inks, and specifically consecrate the inks to produce a personal grimoire, a book of spirits, which is found in, Ratziel. It has a bunch of stuff around not just how to make magical inks, but also the necessity of some kind of magical ink. So the overall approach to doing this kind of work, rather than it's right seeing rather than a particular dogma of a particular recipe. We get the same with the excellent book, The Art of Magic, where, 1567, these two guys start getting their dream of Solomon initially, and then a variety of other dead magicians cropping up. Cyprian is not included, interestingly, although, as my friend and colleague Phil has pointed out, Cyprianic material does crop up in the same kinds of working books and extracts of grimoires and full grimoires that also heavily, clearly influence or are part of the milieu that the excellent book is also coming out of. And the excellent book crucially just says, you need colored ink, and it lists the colors, but there's nothing around, that they're made in some super fancy way on the particular feast day of this saint, while walking backwards and reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards, and with the
that's part two. So that's how you write grimoires, right? It's just this part two is the practical part that you didn't know, and you've been doing it wrong for years.
Right.
Excellent book of the Art of Magic. It is, as long as I've known you, it's been a topic that you brought up. I think, is that what you spoke about at the Day of Conjure? You brought it up.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I think you did another piece on it at over in Brooklyn as well, too.
And I think I'm officially allowed to say this. I've chatted to Peter and Augustus about this before. We're hoping Phil and I's version of the excellent book will be out later this year, or maybe the start of next year. But hopefully, as soon as possible, we're nearing the finish line. The rounds of editing and then finding new material and wanting to include that, and then editing that, and then finding new material in between editing it, are finally coming to a point of like, no, it has to actually. So
active blogs are for of like, something on page 72.
Right.
But yes, thank you. That was what I was hoping to get at without getting at, but you were able to get to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So very excited to be working with Scarlet Imprint. Very, very excited to be working with Phil Legard. His Larkfall blog is great to check out, as is.
It is a great blog.
The hosts of all of his amazing experimental music and his musicology as well, of studying the processes of these things. and how it relates to occult philosophy and magical practices. And not just in terms of, abstract theories of harmony and things, but also how that ties to landscape and, things that get called psychogeography and of those nature. So I'm really excited to be doing that. And hopefully that will be a thing that will be facing us very shortly.
Wonderful. Is it often, because we've talked about this before too, and I think it's just interesting in the concept of, and perhaps can bridge into Liber Spiriti, the notion of consecration through use as opposed to consecration through consecration and use.
Bootstrap.
Yeah. And, it's interesting that if a book is saying, here's the inks, and I don't have to list anything about it. The important thing is the color, multiple colored inks, which is a sign of you would already have to know how to make inks of those colors, which, if you're grinding down precious minerals or obtaining things, which is the notion here of like synthetics are prized by many cultures that like, doesn't matter that it's no longer the substance, or that it's toxic. It is the bright version of that color, and I want it.
Mm-hmm.
The red letter day of like, how do we have this here? To so much so that the Aztec phrase of the Mexica phrase of we need the red, we need the black, which is a specific reference to the two colors of ink that they used to represent different things in the codices. So they painted things, but the average inks were red and black over a white page that was amate paper that is dark in nature, that was then whitewashed, and then red and ink was used on it. So it's the concept of ink itself that we need both, that the contrast between red and black knowledge was important, which is also ants in my head when I was little. Like, oh, it's something there. I have no idea if it is. So
was the red used as a rubric?
I don't know. I would need to look more into the actual material anthropology of that. I know because like a lot of the codices are post-conquest. And so what was done before the conquest is one thing, and a lot of those books were destroyed. And then 40 to 80 years later, monks start asking questions. So amazing amounts of lore are still intact because it's not like the empire went anywhere. It was largely decimated and was continuing to be decimated through disease and enslavement and occupation. But I don't know. I hope to be able to amend that in a footnote.
Oh, sure.
Or an amended blog article, like I encourage every author to do. I was wrong on this page. I'm sorry. It wasn't just a typo.
I get the sense that the multicolored inks are in part for including planetary prayers.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're definitely in those colors.
Yeah.
And when they are specifically listed, which is most of the time, they don't usually just say, oh, just get a bunch of different colors.
Mm-hmm.
They say, get these 7 colors, which do correspond to and then another one. So like when you're not doing planetary stuff. So I think it's pretty clear that's what's going on because the sources were getting it from a heavily planetarily based. And again, with the excellent book, for instance, it's just said that you need a book of calls. It's more important that you call than which particular calls you use.
Thank you. That's lovely. I like this.
Because partly you'll also, if you're doing it right, you already made contact with something that will be telling you this is the call you should use.
Emphasis on spirit contact and practice.
Imagine. Yeah.
Wow. But if I haven't put it on Instagram, Al, no, I had one of the first times in working with parchment in college for an art class, one of my projects for the semester was 7 pieces of goat parchment that I had made all the inks of through precious stones with Latin heptameron invocations and the seal at the top. Mm-hmm. So my memory of doing Venusian malachite was like intense.
And you didn't poison yourself or anyone else?
No. Good. Well, I mean, maybe that's why I'm crazy now. But finding out that there were better ways to do this later and like, wow, this is not easy. My hat's off to monks who, went like the image makers in Tibetan practice. So there's at the Rubin Museum here in New York, there's a room that describes what making tankas are like. And there was often criminals that made them and trained because they worked off negative karma. So they'd done an act, and then they trained under someone. And you had 7 to 9 years on average before you would die from mercury poisoning because you had to lick the brush, which was dipped in mercury, dipped in the ink and applied, and the burning yak fat added fumes that was heated mercury then. So you have all these different things going in to at somewhere around 6 or 7 years, you're going to start to go mad and you will die after making tankas. So this idea of the madness of ink makers, of the people who are making divine images and just the toxicity of that.
Yeah. And that's an inherent part of it. You get the same with jewelers even today. With particular kinds of stone setting, particular kinds of engraving and faceting.
The use of mercury in some Afro-diasporic traditions and the heating of it and what that does in small spaces is like, it's not good for you.
Right.
In addition to grinding up different bones and powders and herbs that should not be aerosolized in any form. Right. Whatsoever, if you want to value your lungs and your mucous membranes. So that's what apprentices are for. You're young, you'll shake it off. Have you had children yet? Good. Okay. Is there any attribution as to what Hael is meant to mean, because it is a common last part, as evidenced by an earlier Google search on a certain esoteric archives for any additional mentions of Michael, Raphael,
all the angels.
Yeah.
There's been some research on how there might be a particular angel, Hael, spelled in a variety of ways because
vowels are invisible in Hebrew, and therefore we can add as many as we want.
Yeah. So there is an extent to which it looks pretty. I like the idea that it's the cut-off suffix of all the other stuff. But no, I've not seen a convincing articulation of what it means so far, although there are a bunch of references to where that might crop up as a spirit and may or may not be the same spirit. So inconclusive. It is shadowly inconclusive. Yeah, it is tenebrous.
Okay, so Hael, Meia Noite, Cyprian. I mean, we've actually talked a fair amount of Liber Spiriti, or at least Grimoires and magic. Having just finished your fourth book course, can you give a nod to what is meant by spirit book?
Oh, sure, yeah.
A little bit more properly than just a grimoire.
Well, it's specifically listed by whoever writes of magical ceremonies, the main talkiest and most sort of like practical treatise that isn't a full system of magic. It is talking about what you need to do when you're doing various rituals. So Pseudo Agrippa, whoever writes that.
Pseudo is a terrible first name.
Yeah, right. Says, for a start, that a book of spirits is used by people who mainly summon evil spirits or unclean spirits. So it's already specifically linked to the practices of what Jake likes to call the other magicians, with capital O, othering. Mainly it says, this is what it looks like. Here's how you make it. You should have the image on one side of the page. You should have the character on the other. You should have the oath above that. You should have the office of the spirit, what it does, who it works under, the timings that it works best to, the allocation of what star it works under or what star you work under to work with it. So it's not the same as saying everyone has to have a planetary correspondence, but it is saying there are times when a particular planetary influence or virtue is useful for doing this work, which I think is a useful distinction. The main things it talks about, there is a perfunctory bit at the end about how to actually use it in terms of the order or the methodology, which is less solid than a single The Solomonic method, which I think is worth pointing out as well. The main thing is about that it offers two methodologies for consecrating the thing, for building it and consecrating it. So there's what it is. It's virgin parchment. It should have the characters and oaths and maybe even images of these spirits in it. The two main methods are either that you conjure each one at a time, which is referred to as the longer process, because you make your circle, you summon the spirit, it puts its hands on the book and swears on it that it'll turn up, and that this is your pact.
What even is a hand out?
The spirit. Right. Okay. So there are bits and pieces where they say that the hand will actually like make the mark on the page, and thus there's the idea of a signature of revealed seals or signatures. There's also some cool tech about you should tie the book up and throw it out of the circle and then like haul it back.
Cable tow it back in?
Yeah. Which I really like. Spirit. Right. It's very, it's a little bit Ghostbusters-esque. The other method, which is referred to as the easier method, is to, in short, take it to a midnight crossroads and do a truncated version of the conjuration where you just list each spirit.
I like the way they think.
Right? Then you bury it. And also crucially, you have to include images on the inside front cover and on the inside back cover, particular images that ensure that only the spirits that you've written in there and that you've called in that big litany of, taking class register turn up. And there are various other provisos of drawing the circle around it when you bury it, drawing it again when you exhume it, and ensuring that only those spirits that you've asked in will go. Over the course of 3 days, they're meant to turn up in their own time and swear on the book. And then you can just go and like harvest it. And that's referred to as an easier method, even though it's, perhaps less laborious than doing all the conjurations again for every spirit, but it has its own risks, I guess one would say, and its own protocols. And that's the bulk of what the fourth book or the treatise of magical ceremonies within the collection called the Fourth Book of Occult Philosophy has to say about the Book of Spirits.
That's interesting. The permutations of that I have seen over the years and different expressions that may not necessarily know that they're working with that reference in that way, but the kind of combination of both sides of doing the conjurations or doing a bunch of conjurations, but there is a start where you announce, here's my litany, I'm going to call all these, and it's not done until you have called all of them. And then there's a closing litany of the same thing, oftentimes midnight crossroads, to kind of seal it so that the devil of the crossroads comes. And this is when it's revealed who your patron might be, or after you've called all of the, I've seen people do, when I say people, I mean two. I know two magicians who work together. Curious that have done it with Solomonic, and by that I mean 72, the classic 72,
the Leisure of Solomon.
Yes, the Ars Notoria 72, second chapter or whatever it is. Is that right? Okay, so that after conjuring all of those, that then the king that you are supposed to work with will reveal itself, and like your personal court. If we borrow the kind of Aphrodisiac tradition of what spirits are around for you most affinity-wise or in line with your task.
Right. And this is also present in the fourth book in talking about several methods of evoking unclean spirits. And so that method of, call, constrain, et cetera, license, whatever order those happen in, because there are several, emphasizes heavily authority and hierarchy, not just in terms of you have to use this name to get this spirit to do what you want, but also that you should be looking towards the particular manifestation of that authority when you do this stuff, which is, it starts to sound a lot more like who turns up for you, who stands up for you.
Yeah. The other thing it brings up too is lineage packs of the accounts in the Caribbean, especially of people who have done all the conjurations at some point. And then if you are their student, they can consecrate the whole book for you very quickly because they've already done all the work. So then those spirits recognize the pacts that your ritual grandfather or great grandfather made. And therefore it's a very different thing to do the shortcut because you have been training with someone for 8 years and you've never done the conjurations yourself personally, but now they hand you a book and say, by everybody that I've conjured over all these years, here is your book.
Right.
And that type of thing, which is less likely in classical European grimoireology of the High Renaissance and later because of the secrecy of things and not necessarily, we don't know what was done, but the Caribbean certainly has exposed a kind of lineage methodology there that makes sense of like, well, that old man in the woods can teach you and you go there and follow that.
And conversely, if we're talking about personalized spirits, there's a ton of practices in the fourth book and in a variety of things called Agrippas or Agrippa teaching necromancy or other kinds of texts like that, which are probably drawing from aspects of the opera, which was, a bunch of things attributed to Agrippa, culminating around after his death and as his reputation as a black magician is also, bubbling up to the surface and converting and being, his status being literally denigrated and shadow lengthening across all of Europe. As Faustus puts it, that you would generate the name of the spirit that you were mainly working through, your personal daimon, through astrological means. And then once you had that name, you could also, in a variety of ways, turn those letters into a seal, and from that seal into an image, and also certainly from the means to conjure it so that it appears and will be your go-to patron, or indeed a variety of techniques around deciphering or generating the name of the spirit of that particular operation, or the spirit of the soul of the world at this time when you're doing this thing, or the particular intelligent president of the planet which rules this working at this time.
Which is, shout out there that is something that back on the Spiritus Mundi list, Christopher Warnock used to go heavily into that. And I know that when you do a natal chart reading with him, he will calculate.
Oh yeah, his Major's reading as well, which is a form of just looking at the relevant houses of what's relevant for someone with a magical practice. Will also include the specific name of your natal angel, and it sometimes gets called. It's a big thing, it seems, for Renaissance magicians, and that putting that in context makes so much more sense. The idea of like the secrecy, the like having to rely on your own practices, having to do that stuff rather than. That seems to happen at least as often. And when we're talking about the magic of books and the books of magic, it seems to happen as much that precisely because of Liber Spiritum, if you open it, has all that like Sorcerer's Apprentice stuff in it. Like it is, you aren't meant to flip through them. You're meant to have registers and seals, which I think is referring to like particular ribbons, particular bookmarks, so that you know exactly where everything is. So you're not flipping through it. Opening that book should be the setting of an old. Right. There's literally a notion that the spirits will get out and do terrible things. That one of the main stories about why Agrippa is so terrible is that he leaves a book out and one of his apprentices opens it and is killed by it. And then follows this kind of Weekend at Bernie's style cover up where he summons the spirit back to possess the dead body, to wander around the marketplace to give him an alibi before it drops dead in front of everyone nowhere near his house.
Weekend at Bernie's. I saw a fantastic design for a spirit book that had the center parchment area, which was all specifically uterine calf, which is highly prized in Jewish practice because the notion of an unborn skin must manifest something. It's even closer to the heavenly
Pure potential.
Yeah. And it's also very soft and its pores are very tight. But the book in the center was just the seal and the character. So the outside, it was like an equilateral cross that when you opened it, it stacked on itself. And there was the astrological information was on one side and another book that was there with corresponding bookmarks of what you're talking about. So when you open it up, it was this crossroads with talismans and everything around it. Idealized. This was a plan for a book. I've never actually seen it, but hey, maybe I'll make it one day. Maybe you will make it. But the idea that there were 5 books basically that were 4 books surrounding this central book, which was literally only the seals and the characters. So that when that was open, that was the spirit incarnate. And that the spirit, the other information was provided around, and there were corresponding pages that you could go through. So there was no flipping, there was no mistaking anything. And that the particular plans for this were embedded into a very ornate glass table that only had the center part of the book exposed. So you could lay out all your research material so that if you spilled something on it, that it would not ruin it. But whether or not the seal got destroyed, the spirit was still in the book. So if you spilled something on that, but you needed it exposed. So there was this kind of donut square that had the middle book exposed. And it was a really lovely idea. Let's make it. It always brings up that kind of warlock thing of like, if I just pronounce the name of God backwards, what is this going to do?
I would like to start with Jet, because we also almost got into that when we were like, it's also, because you were saying it's also Black Amber, which is a super cool name for a superheroine as well. So I thought, generally what we do is we list off things that the stone does and then talk about how they might relate to each other in terms of practice and historiola and so on. Gigantic, as it's referred to as. And gosh, snakes get a really hard deal in lapidaries, There's so few things that are like, this is when you want to make friends with a snake. This is when you want to talk to snakes. No, it's all about dispelling them. It's all about driving them away. And interestingly, Jet, I think it's interesting that there's a lot of stuff about Jet being on fire and it being used as an incense, which I think is interesting in terms of what we think of as typical and atypical or usual or unusual incense ingredients. And the very fact of setting stones on fire is pretty cool. So yeah, it is said that Jet, when on fire, drives away snakes. And by extension, all of that other stuff that is often connoted by dispelling snakes. It dispels hysteria, for instance. It destroys devils. So it's a lot of stuff about snakes and evils or false friends or those kinds of things. And interestingly, it destroys enchantments as well, which I think is the possible easiest line in terms of talking about Jet and Devil's Dung. And Cyprian is about counter magic, and not just counter magic, but aggressive counter magic, of not just protective. They tried to do something and their spell failed, but they tried to do it and it exploded in their faces.
Jet is interesting because there's it's a form of wood, right? It's fossilized wood that then becomes high pressured through either carbon compression through salt water or through fresh water, which makes harder soft jet, which I always find fascinating, that the water changes the density. That is interesting in a lot that there's hard and soft jet, and that jet gains a lot of our modern sensibilities of it does come from Victorian revival of it, because as mourning jewelry and its association with the dead and the necromantic rites of the common housewife. And also there is a connection for me in the sense of breaking enchantments and ending spells, specifically because in one of the places that you find jet in Europe is, yes, of course, England has a huge jet dash, which is the western end of the world for people, right? And that Santiago de Compostela is famous for its jet stash, its jet deposit. And Sendero de Compostela is the end of the world. It's the setting sun. It is the most popular pilgrimage route because Rome and Jerusalem are so far away. So to the pilgrimage route of St. James in medieval times, which started in France, goes through Basque Country in northern Spain, Galicia, the area where the Book of St. Cyprian was most popularly distributed in northern Spain there. And then all the way to the edge of the Iberian Peninsula, which was considered the end of the world, and it's the setting sun. So it's the scallop shell of the pilgrim.
I was going to say, is it used for pilgrim badges, to your knowledge? Is it carved in that way?
No, the scallop shell and the gourd are always the way that the pilgrimage is acknowledged. But the fact jet is there is a way of kind of, not necessarily badge, but there does seem to be some connection of it being parallel in that's where the sun goes into the Western Ocean, and that is where your spells will be buried. They will be no more because of it. So jet is a token from that thing that it's that the sun, some lore, or local lore of it's the sun scorching the earth at one point because the oceans were different or something. I can't remember the exact thing, but that it does deal with scorched earth being too close to the sun at that western edge of the world. I mean, also like Turkey, Poland, and like I think Chile and the southern Andean mountains in South America are all famous for it. And certainly England was very well known for it, and the Anglo-Saxons loved them some Jet. And I think the timeline was interesting about that, of just that our good friend Liber Wikipedia go into a fairly extensive history of Jet's use and saying like it fell out of fashion by the 3rd century AD in Roman Britain and like didn't really come around again as a big thing until the Victorian era.
Right. Where Whitby, it goes crazy. And, Whitby being the so goth that Dracula tried to go there is already, a great place for something so black and also so light so that you could wear a ton of it. And it takes to carving pretty well, I'm told.
It's very soft. So, I mean, it takes to carving very well, but it can shatter very easily too. Not soft, but brittle from what, my experience of it. But then again, maybe hard versus soft are two different things, but often rosaries and things like that. Because, I mean, it looks like black glass.
Yeah.
Because of the kind of Saturnine office of monks, right? So
for sure.
Like the Benedictine cross is always lacquered in black, there's these carryovers that are so interesting.
There's also a lot of stones that deal with, the most common things are like eyesight or teeth as well, right? And I think the easiest answer is that those were really painful for most people for most of human history, right? Especially once the supplies of sugar and sugary things get more circulated, but the actual improvement in dentistry doesn't. Do you think there's other emblematic meanings of things with teeth? I mean, specifically jet is said in decoctions of wine to heal toothache, and it's steeped in water to strengthen gums. Now, obviously, I don't want to unpsychologize. I guess I don't want to, make those mythic and say that by gums they're actually referring to, I don't know, the foundations of the fecund earth and the coming of the sun in spring or anything like that. Because clearly it was like, okay, this is what you actually use for actual, physic. But do you come across many examples of teeth, also things that are good for teeth, also having analogous, more, shall we say, magical qualities?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's more just curiosity from while you're talking about it. I mean, I think the interesting thing of Jet's similarity to coal, it's not coal, but it was an anthracite is the substitute for Jet, as far as imitation, and that glass is used to imitate it. And certainly the quality of what a tooth is like, the hardness of a tooth, and the brittleness when a tooth starts to get rotten, similar to Jet, which, like you said, it carves easily, but it shatters because it's brittle. It's not. It doesn't get fine details in the carving process. So there's something interesting there about like the parallel to what teeth are made of and what they feel like, I think. I also think it's interesting because teeth are warm. They're not cold, right? So you touch a tooth, you can feel its warmth. And Jet is warm to the touch. It's not glass. Glass is cold, but Jet is traditionally warm. It's one of the ways for people, if you're calm and you can feel it, like you can tell it is cut glass to look like Jet versus actual Jet, because Jet will be warmer. I don't know. There's just things that come to my mind there on that side of it. And also the side of it that anything with tar in it or coal can be very good for any type of surface, skin, inflammation, infection, things like that. So I wonder if chewing coal or, the kind of artisanal coal things that were very popular in the last, like a year ago, of black masks, black everything, black tea, black toast, black butter, black, putting activated charcoal in everything. But again, charcoal is not jet, but there's still something interesting to that, especially since they are so fluid between each other. In addition to the mourning jewelry, there seems to be a carryover. The mourning side of it, yes, it's black, and that means that, it's mourning because of the color association, but that it averts the evil eye is very heavy. That in Hispanic culture, azabache, which means jet, is carved into the shape of the figa, the hand with the thumb between the forefinger and the middle finger. And this is the fig hand. But this is used all over, obviously, Italian Mediterranean culture. But in Hispanic culture, like, azabache refers to both the jet, the actual jet material or mineralite, as well as to have an azabache just means to have that shape or a blackish thing to avert the evil eye. And I think that's interesting to pinning those to anything over anything. I was going to say any young child instead of boy or girl that's small, to have a small azabache pin, which often looks like an earring type of thing of like a little gold.
Yes, or belts. There was the conference I was just at. There was a talk on amulets and the link between what we give to and appropriate charms and what that said about selfhood, and especially in depiction in art history. And I can't remember the specific one. I'll put it up in the notes and put a picture up. But
no, that's cute.
Add it to the pile. No, there were beautiful portraits of various young, future kings and queens when they were baddies in their dresses, and it's like a belt with just all these charms, all the charms, including a couple of jet magnifico, along with holding coral and Betzawas as well, obviously, and a bunch of other ones. Which is also interesting in terms of like, this is a picture of my baby, and this baby will one day be king of this land. What more apt context for making sure that the baby is just like laden with protective charms, especially in those cultures where, you don't look at the kid, let alone, compliment it before it's, in a phone book.
Oh God, that's very old school Mexican culture. Like you don't look at babies. Don't look at your baby. Stop looking at the baby. As far as traditional uses, because there is the Pliny, the elder,
the Eldar.
Yeah, the light of the Eldar. Pliny, light of the Eldar. Its fumes detect attempts to simulate a disabling illness or state of virginity. So its fumes are good in case a woman is pretending to be a virgin when she's not.
Yeah. It discovers, dissembling. Disemblination? Is that the word? No, it's definitely not the word. Yeah, in that context, I feel like that's part of that whole drives away snakes as the snake in the grass, specifically the person that says one thing but means another.
Oh, but the snake in the grass, because your snake is trying to go into the grass. That was more metaphor than I was ready for.
There's another one about it protecting chastity, which I think is a way of phrasing the same kind of thing. Oh yeah, and there's a thing about if it's crushed into water and you make it, if the water is then filtered and given to the girl being tested if she is a virgin, she'll be unable to urinate. In the write-up I saw on that, it doesn't indicate when she is able to again, because that seems particularly cruel if that's just permanent now. And that's if she is a virgin as well, if she was telling the truth. Which is again that thing like
she's the witch.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fair cop.
I mean, I would be remiss to not, because we talked about it when we talked with Amber, but the very well publicized tradition of amber jet alternating necklace for high priestesses who have hived off covens in Wicca, which then quickly became taken to any high priestess could wear it, and then eventually anybody who's third degree, because try and separate a gay man from their amber and jet jewelry. Just try it. No, in a lot of the older texts, it specifically said high priestesses who had sometimes 3 covens hived off of them, or at least a coven had hived off. I love those kind of microcultures that formed so quickly, where there were like set rules to make them feel very legitimate and very arcane, be it ordained, as it were. Those kind of microcosmic cultures that happened. It reminds me of the talk about Alexander's that was at the Witchcraft Museum last year, or that was this year. Oh dear God, it was only 2 months ago. Of just the kind of a culture of what that is, and like creating rules for the societies that you lead and that you're a part of, and what those are. But there are specific things you can do with Amber and Jet if one should want to pose as one might be able to allow one to have posed.
Yeah.
What?
Elegantly put.
Thank you. So okay, so Jet,
Opens locks as well. Opens locks. I like that one. I like this idea of if a binding or if a spell is a form of locking, and this, is counter magic and destroys enchantments or destroys devils or dispels hysteria or drives away snakes, then this feels like a natural extension of that. It opens that which is locked.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So, I mean, in some ways, it's like weirdly between coal and petrified wood and amber. I mean, it's that thing where it's a mineral-like because it's not a mineral, but it has mineral inclusions. Like, isn't Jet has pyrite inclusion sometimes?
Oh,
it is one of the more common mineral inclusions that can happen with Jet. It's the sparkly Jet. But I also find its use very interesting in kind of New Age crystal versions of things.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically in Mexico, of Jet being very much about removing negative influences, but the touching Jet after you clean someone helps take the last little bit of the thing off of you, and then like putting that and burying your Jet in the earth and digging it up on certain moon phases and things like that, and peeing on it and all these. I've heard so many different things from different people I've interviewed and studied with, but
that's cool. So it was alive, and then it goes into the underworld and becomes part of the underworld as well in terms of a mineralite, and thus it can help pull that bad, that evil, that malefica off someone and direct it into the earth again.
I knew one curandero that called it his sapo, meaning his toad.
Mm.
And I know another curandera, the doña, that called it the egg. The egg.
And then an egg for, and I'm probably going to sound culturally pretty ignorant at this point, which shock horror, but it's any way related to like limpia, like egg cleansing.
You could.
Limpia can mean more things than just eggs.
Yeah, you can clean with an egg for sure. But you can also clean with Jet. I know a man who has a Jet crucifix that he has super glued together many times, because if you drop things when you're cleaning with them, they tend to break. But I don't know why she called it the egg. That was just what she called her it was a Jet piece, actually not round at all. It was just the egg. It was a very mysterious name for it, and somewhat disconcerting, actually. And this is a French name, by the way, J. It's a little bit like the yes character. So, ferula, the plant that gives us, or the plant genus species. Yes, there's the genus. Ferula, the species genus.
Relative of fennel, right?
Most likely, definitely abiaceae. So it's related. That's parsley, carrot, all those lovely plants. It's a Eucot astrid, if I remember correctly. But it's the same family as carrot and Queen Anne's lace and coriander and fennel and hemlock and parsley and parsnip and lots of other things. Angelica, but
and starch, but like not a dissimilar odor from some kinds of angelica.
All the rest of those plants, yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, and I think its history of trade is quite interesting because it's heavily found in Iran and Afghanistan, which are historically also the places where the lapis monopoly was held. I was told that the Egyptians invented Egyptian blue, synthetic blue pigment, so they wouldn't have to trade with the then Afghanistan empire, of traders that were trying to sell them crushed lapis. But so Asafoetida is interesting because it is a common food flavoring in many different Asian cookings. It is a bit strong in large amounts, and it is not a flavor Westerners are quite used to, but it does have an almost oniony, leaky type of flavor.
Oh yeah, it's great. I lived with a guy from Rajasthan for a while as a flatmate, and he he taught me a little bit of the cooking. His mum had taught him very little of which I remember, other than it's about the size of the things that you cut your potatoes and your veg and stuff in, and then the order in which you add it. And he used a lot of Asafoetida, and it was delicious food, and definitely leaned into that onion.
And it's often get with curry and turmeric. So specifically with turmeric into other things like curries that are made with different beans, lentils, and things like that, or with the dal and things like that. And something Josh Rogan Josh. I mean, in person. Got it.
Yeah. It doesn't Rogan. Yeah, he is it in Rogan Josh. Yeah. For sure. Yeah, no, it goes really well with bell pepper. Adds to that sweetness.
And gum Arabic and other things that are used as fixatives and things like that to help it. It gets much milder in its flavor when added into things like ghee.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
But okay, so we got the cooking side of it. What, pray tell, is its magical use?
Well,
why would you want to put the devil's shit on a charcoal and let it burn?
Well,
You're devil.
if we accept that to, at least a pre-modern, which is its own category of far too widely and therefore a multitude of sins, pre-modern European ideas that it's a bad smell, then you've got the basic notion that good smells bring good spirits and bad smells bring bad spirits. So you would think that it was about bringing bad spirits. Specifically, though, it seems to be about placating them and then getting them to leave. So the common thing is to get rid of spirits, but specifically spirits that pop up who are unwanted during a ritual, which is really interesting to me. Of like, it's kind of fulfilling both roles of like feeding them something they like, but in a way of propitiating them and then getting them to get out of the way, while also being used as a bad thing. Bad smells also banish spirits.
Well, it's interesting because it reminds me, and this is not necessarily, I'm not proposing why that technology works, but there is the type of introduction of certain plant materia in some Afro-Caribbean traditions of when you want a spell, a working, trabajo, whatever you want to call it, to make sure it's working, you put things down that you would normally give the spirit after it's done the work. To say, you've already been here, look, the thing should be done. Why isn't it done? And Asafoetida, when you describe it of like banishing unwanted spirits, it's like, we've already had a few of your crew here. See, the air smells like sulfur. That, you don't need to come. We got it. And I always think of it of like, I'm going to make the air smell like farts so that I don't smell your fart as much. I
think it's a really cool feature that it points out that just because, you might have done everything right and still a spirit that isn't the actual spirit that you need or that you're after might turn up as well. And that's something that you need to be aware of and you need to be able to handle in some way, even if that's using a variety of other solutions to that problem, that it is a real problem that was identified. But more generally, it is counter magical. And again, that aggressive counter magic. So not just breaking a spell, but returning harm that is done to you in various ways. Reversing harm.
Don't just turn the knife around, like twist it.
Right. Not just neoing their bullets so that they drop to the ground, but actually, deflecting them back so that they strike the one that sent it. And certainly, from the accounts I've read for some traditions of hoodoo have the idea of being linked to something, either that you sprinkle it on a doorstep of the person that you think is cursing you to return that evil. So like, again, expressly, it's not just something, something that you fix a candle with in your house that offers protection. You are actively going out and laying something on someone. There's also an account of a bottle which gets called a witch bottle. I might get.
You might argue with your academic credentials.
I might, do my academic lineage proud and be a, prick about it. I named the witch bottle. Yeah, right. You put it in a bottle with things like vandal root and black hen feathers, and that reverses harm. And in some accounts, you even bury that bottle where the person you think is cursing you will walk over. So it combines some foot track stuff as well. But so again, it's some of these workings you need you to have worked out who is after you, as opposed to a sort of blanket protection thing, which is again something I'd qualify around like aggressive counter magic, if we're going to use that category. Also, interestingly, if we're on a hoodoo tip, it doesn't just harm enemies, it also keeps off the law, apparently, which is an interesting use of like, you smell bad and thus are left alone, maybe?
Perhaps. I think it's also, I think maybe you smell bad and you blend in the rest of the stuff. I don't know. Like, I know there's some uses culturally of it in the far Mideast. By that, I just mean the Middle East, of its association with invisibility.
Oh.
So I'm not sure.
I mean, that's what I would think about in terms of law keep away or the kinds of like don't get noticed by the cops. It feels a lot more like invisibility, like, or possibly like warding and binding, I guess. But not what I would. Yeah, not that makes more sense to me than something that expressly harms enemies. It's also said to purify specifically from bad habits. So again, that idea that makes me think of using something that is kind of bad to sympathetically soak or pull what is bad from you, in the same way of the Xenexton or of dried toad amulets and things like that, of using something that pulls out bad things from you. Not perhaps unlike if we were going to take that very saturnine take on Jet, used for cleansing, because it pulls the darkness out of you.
It's interesting. I mean, just to go with Jet in that way, because it does contain, like, it's easy to give it a static charge, that black amber of like, what happens when things are staticky, things stick, right? When you are covered, when something is staticky, other things can stick to it very easily. It's palpable. All of a sudden it's buzzing. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, especially if it is paired with feathers. Something that's very good at receiving at sticking to things with a charge.
And Asafoetida does linger in the air. It lingers on the breath. It itself
sticks around. Yeah.
So I'm not sure what that is. Just, it's a fascinating thing.
Have you ever come across its use in anything tied to Cyprian or a Cyprianic mode of operating, or a particular set of recipes?
It's added in like it's like a substitute, or rather not a substitute, but like a modifier of the sulfur, and particularly that sulfur brings the presence of certain spirits as well as a exorcism thing, and Asafoetida can be used also with turpentine, which is a very common Iberian exorcism smell.
Yeah.
Turpentine smell.
Was also used for, actually getting a lot of things off cattle, right?
Yeah.
That raises an interesting point about sulfur and Sulfurino, the dude when we were talking earlier about Bacon being the man, Roger being the writer of Cyprian's book.
My head goes to pork immediately.
Of course it does.
It is a man.
But the idea of we were talking earlier about the book being written by someone on Cyprian's direction or under his patronage, and that's the case with Sulfurino, right? Yeah, Sulfurinos. And so we have an extra layer of dead magician there, and meaning the sulfurous one, right?
Yeah.
So there's a notion of, that's interesting to me.
And I find it interesting too, like with the exorcism side, is that the smell goes away, right?
Yeah.
So it gets really stinky for a little bit and then it dissipates, which the bad spirits their presence is now called out. They are recognized, and then it dissipates and you replace it with sweet smells or things like that. Or just let the air naturally shift. There's right. That's interesting.
Yeah. So if we can say that, certainly with Peter, that there's a sense of using, would it be fair to say that it was using something unpleasant to combat something even more unpleasant?
Maybe it's a little homeopathic thing in that way, but I'm really interested in these kind of methodologies of putting the thing down to show that your people have already, like, we've already had you here, of like,
that's great. Yeah.
Pretending that the house has been ransacked so the thieves just walk by it. Saturday Night Live, get where like it's a luxury car, but it looks like crap on the outside, but you roll down the window, it's beautiful on the inside. The windows show you a rundown car with a stolen 8-track player on the inside. When you look in the window, when it's down, it's a luxury car. That kind of like could Asafoetida be a part of that kind of mentality? I think it's easily lends itself to that. Just the idea that sulfur is obviously used to banish, right? To banish the spirits as well as to call them. And there is something there with this thing of let's make the smell that it smells like the people, the things we don't want to hear, because then it will go away. It's kind of like, I don't know. Is it like smelling your own armpit when you're really, really smelly so that you get used to it and be like, oh my God, that's what I smell like right now?
Is it like using lion piss to keep away neighborhood cats?
Well, that's just because there's a really big cat, like the king of cats is in town, and that's just scary, but maybe?
Well, yeah. I mean, if it is the devil's dung, if the devil has already, marked this territory, and so the minor devils now know to scalp it.
Sure.
I really like that thing about they've already been here though. That feels somewhere closer to or almost invisibility mystery stuff of like as well as it's a kind of representative magic as well, right? We'll make it up as if they were here, and not exactly in a fake it till you make it, but definitely in a sense of like employing a ruse with the spirit and employing a kayfabe maybe of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of systems you can talk about that when you're in dire need or to piss off the spirit into action, that you could offer it, you call it after you've made the offerings, and then you untap all the bottles and like take all the alcohol and leave the bottles on their slides, and like you leave the food half eaten, like, the bears are going to go after Goldilocks, or Very Court is going to go after Thomas, and it's just going to be the thing of how very dare you.
Oh, you blame someone else for eating the offerings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blame your enemy for eating the offering.
Yeah, a fit up job.
It was so-and-so.
Right.
It's what so-and-so thinks of you, You're Here's some Asafoetida. That's what, Lady Catherine of whatever her kingdom is down the road thinks of you.
Right.
I think you're amazing, but she thinks you're devil's dung.
My favorites are those the Egyptian ones where you where you put on a bunch of invisibility stuff, then actually kill the sacred animal and then call them up and be like, look what he did.
Yeah. You framed someone else by being the guilty party yourself with the full intent of frame.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got Asafoetida and Jet. As far as connections to Cyprian and Justina and the magician card was a very no-brainer fit.
Yeah.
As far as how things go, because Cyprian is called the Sorcerer Saint among many other things.
Right.
And I don't know, the magician card is such an interesting one because it's the juggler, right? So it's the first card of the deck, the first numbered card. If we consider 0 a placeholder, if the Fool is indeed not the first card, but the card that is binding them all together.
The medium by which they can even exist. Yeah.
The one ring to rule them all. It's a 0.
The foundational womb that allows the others to emerge. Yeah.
And like traditionally it's the mountebank, right? It's the stage magician.
Right. Hence the jongleur.
But eventually it becomes the ritual magician. So we go from the deceptive one, relying on tricks, to someone who is using the tools of magic to explore the mind and the consciousness, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and that shift occurring as the word magician itself is coming to mean more a stage conjurer. It's also interesting, isn't it? Like that push back against it.
And you have still the one hand raised up, one hand lowered, depending on the specific deck. It changes, but of course the Rider Waite goes into very specific ideas about that. And the weapons of the magician on the table in modern tarot of the elemental weapons, quote unquote, of the Gwandan, versus just random knives and cheese and things like that.
Are you suggesting that cheese isn't a powerful tool of a magician?
Oh, I think it is. I just think people don't quite understand it. But I have many recommendations for you to explore the power of cheese and its baptismal rites and the bones of cheese and the relationship between the white blood of the rennet acting upon the red blood, which both makes babies as well as cheese. So wonderful. But I was really interested in, I was just starting to watch Westworld recently on the HBO. And Anthony Hopkins' character, who's one of the creators of the world, the little boy asks him, like, is it magic? And Anthony Hopkins' character says, everything's magic except to the magician. And I was like, whoa, that's some deep shit right there. That's wonderful. Gives a lot of fruit, right? We always talk about how any sufficiently advanced science will look like magic to those witnessing it. And so there's always this relationship between two. All magic has explanation. We just don't necessarily know the reason why ourselves. And that's very interesting too.
Yeah, a reflection. Yeah, a card that asks us to reflect on magic itself rather than take a magical perspective on some things.
I find the predominance of the lemniscate in the magician card quite interesting, that it is spotted in the Marseille Tarot of having the hat brim form of the infinity sign.
Yeah.
But when you get to the Rider Waite, that there is just a flat out actual lemniscate floating above his head, which is in place of a halo.
What's your favorite interpretation of that infinitude?
Immediately what comes to mind is the journey that we talk about from the Fool, the magician, all the way up to the World card is not a one-time process. This is not Protestant theology. You know, you're not saved once by the light of Jesus. No, you're saved every moment you remember that you want to be saved. That type of thing with the lemniscate in this is that the magician at no point should sit on their laurels or rest on their laurels. You have to constantly be going to the work and get faster at some things.
It's okay. Yeah, it's a butt cheek mark of where they were sitting.
Perhaps, yes.
No, that's a beautiful sentiment. I like that very much. The ongoing work, and of course mirrors the two of coins or pentacles or discs, or however you want to put it, in terms of still the juggler and still the first manifestation after the seed of the ace of pentacles or discs or what have you is the Lord of Change, and is the change of the tides of fortune behind them and ahead of them, this loop of the two discs. And so that brings to mind that.
And just the notion that the magician is the divine will inside man, the divine motive, the prima motiva, what is it that pushes people forward? What starts the deck in this way? And I don't know, there's something interesting to that, especially those of us that have assumed the moniker of magician in some way,
right?
That it is meant to be first an insult. You're an illusionist, sir.
Yeah. And what does that mean? And how do we take that? The con job and the conjurer, yeah.
Brings up those memes of like, what I think I do, what my wife thinks I do.
Right. And actually do.
Yes, but what do you do? You're all those things. Yeah. That reality of magic, right? It's all those things. So I think what's interesting that Cyprian too, we talk about the world above, the world below, and the table, the double cube altar of how it works, the right hand up, the left hand down, of Cyprian's retaining of his former nefarious infernal magics. And just that balance point between the two, the Cyprian Chonti wand that is used in Peruvian Mesa shamanism, where the Cyprian wand is in the middle.
Right.
The shift from the right side of the mesa to the left side of the mesa, or back and forth, just right. The one that can serve both sides. And
the good and the bad, right?
Beautiful stuff with that. Eduardo the Healer, that book. There's a beautiful prayer. I'll put it in the notes. No. We're going to have shots ready for every time we say I'll
it's very long recording. Those are some dangerous drinking games there, and they verge out of games and into drinking abuse pretty quickly.
I would never abuse you, Al.
Yeah, there we go. Abuse of power is something that the magician card sometimes connotes, right? In terms of its reversal.
Absolutely.
We get a lot of the dualities placed between 1 and 2, between the magician and the high priestess as well, of these Aristotelian metaphysics of active and passive principles and things like that. The magician is the doer, and the high priestess is the done unto, and those kinds of things.
The fuck type of person, but hey, whatever.
Sure, right.
But I do think that just the magician is such an interesting start to the tarot. Because the Fool is really difficult to examine outright.
Yeah.
The Fool is a strange card to show up. I don't agree that it's just always like the innocence or like the pay attention to what's going on that many people interpret. Like it needs to be, it's so mercurial that it's good for good and bad for bad, or sometimes reverses the flow of things. And that's its own thing. The primordial air,
not even the first breath, the air that allows the first breath.
Yes.
The magician itself is attributed to Mercury, the planet. And so you have the notion of where Mercury meets the possibility of primal air, and we move past the field or the medium through which things can flow, and then the notion of flow itself through that medium.
Well, and then if you look at the lemniscate, right, we're going into motions of retrograde there, which is interesting. Forward and retrograde, and the great Mercury retrograde, dooms the modern cosmos.
Definitely. None of the other planets, they're all fine. Yeah.
Well, also the role of, Mars retrograde gave everyone a lesson this year, I think. But the role of the magician trickster figure in being at home in Mercury retrograde, or this idea of when other people's communications are gone, the magician can step in and still communicate. And there's something really beautiful about that, about the metaphors tapping into the unseen powers, being able to mediate with those things. And for instance, there's the notion of magic as an act of rebellion. For so long, that magic itself is rebellion against God's order. Even with God's authority, it's against God's order. Right. And that magic and prayer were very different things. But ultimately they aren't, but they are, but they aren't. But
right.
That's its own wonderful.
That same duality, non-duality is really easy to impose or find in the lily and the rose, which are present in the Rider-Waite-Smith magician. So you have the lily of martyrdom and the rose of, I guess they're both, martyring symbols, but one the earthly blood and the other the spiritual beautification.
And the blood of martyrdom and the rose of or the lily of resurrection, promise of everlasting life, because lilies do last a long time, and their own associations with the crossroads and the kingdom of the souls, and Quimbanda always stands up there too for me. And of course the rose of Sharon and the lilies of the valley, of course. So
the white and the red as well, most broadly, which is something that obviously people like Waite and things and Crowley later on in the Thought Tower are very interested in that interplay of these things and the swapping of them between each other, the eagle and the lion and so on. This is, this is interesting as a geomancer in terms of having to look at binary things again and not just go, well, of course, any binary is an artificial imposition, but looking at what use does that have? How does it code things? What things can actually be built from when we build geomantic figures or on-offs or binary or computer chips?
Well, I find it interesting thinking about the default nature of binary at rest, quite interesting too, that a computer switch or computer coding is, yes, binary, and that it's on and off, but really off is the natural state of things and on is an added quality. So it's really 1 equals 2 equals 1, not in counting, but in essence, which is interesting to me, that if we look at the magician card, he has one arm up and one arm down. What's the natural tendency for an arm is to be down. That arm is pointing, so it's still active. But for the most part, that arm is already in a position that's very natural to standing there in. The arm is a very different thing. And so the off position, while it creates a second, is completely reliant upon the first. And yes, there's that whole, the white dot and the black dot and the white of the yin yang. But I don't know, I like thinking about that kind of thing of dualism that's not dualistic.
Right. The why not both argument. The thing about the one arm, one up, one down, it does illustrate that point you're making about, in retrograde, when the world is turned upside down, he's still got one up, one down, right? He remains, albeit now a little bit more pendulous, a little bit more falling maybe, or a little bit more of a, we can't quite see his little back feet maybe hanging on there, but he's still in the same posture. That notion of being half in, half out means that when everything else is reversed, you're still half in, half out.
Yeah, the permanent liminality is quite difficult, right? When one is neither or, which the true meaning of liminality there, right, in the anthropological sense, as we talked about, I believe, of just the state of something when you have started the ritual, but it's not ended yet. And you are not the finished thing, but you are no longer the thing you were when you came through the door. And that is why liminality of the term was invented, was to describe that state. So there's an anticipation of something, not just stuck between,
But then we can have those discussions of what is it to be in the between? What is the Bardo state? But it reminds me, for Cyprian, this is an important thing because the battle between the Christian and the pagan that happens in the Cyprianic revival, that happens with any major saint revival. If someone is attracted to it from a different sensibility of their relationship with the big Jesus in the sky, the argument of can you work Cyprian without being Christian is he going to enforce Christianity? And some people will say, absolutely, it's a saint. That's what the thing is going to do. But it's also the thing of I will share and building up of many of the things that I have talked with Jake about this year. It's been something that he's been wrestling with because it's so much a part of my worldview of being from Catholic framework where there is no conflict between Christianity and paganism. That there's no rebellion. There's no need to rebel against Jesus to embrace paganism because, it's not in Catholic colonial history for Hispanic Catholics to be like, oh, well, we shunned Mother Church and we're still okay. So Protestant identity forms out of that. Kind of interesting to go forms out of that. But the Costas Palamas, it was the Greek poet. We are neither Christians nor pagans with crosses and pagan symbols. We are trying to build the new life whose name is not yet known. Very Cyprianic. It is the merging of the two hands. The two hands serve the head, the person, the heart, the feet. They are not just the left hand goes off and does its own thing and then magically boomerangs back to you. That's really cool if it does. But just the notion that, again, for me and my own explorations of identities and things like that, of being half Mexican and half what we call just Anglo in a Mexican identity. What does it mean to be half of something that is a race that's known for being half of something? Mexican identity is formed on the great myth of the mestizaje that we have indigenous blood and Spanish blood mixed perfectly. And, so they're mixed bloods already. According to it, the mestizaje would mean miscegenated is how you would translate it into English, but in Spanish, it's just used all the time. And mestizo, you're a mudblood. But this is Mexico's identity. And then to be someone who is half that, it brings up interesting explorations of that. And so for me, going through the lesson that I had to learn with the Virgin Guadalupe, for years, wanting her to be Tonantzin, the earth deity, a form of Coatlicue. And saying like she is. And then it was actually Bryant Holman, rest in peace, Bryant, who pointed out like, look, I don't mean to be the devil's advocate. He always did. He always argumentative son of a bitch, and I loved him. But the notion that, okay, the Virgin of Guadalupe is how she'd been identified for a long time now. The Aztecs were only around for 250 years. So the concept of Tonantzin may have replaced something else that was before it, but Tonantzin herself, 250 years. Followed by 400 plus years of Virgin Guadalupe coming at that thing. So at this point, she's technically, historically, more Virgin Guadalupe than she ever was Tonantzin. And what does that mean? Like, here I was trying to erase part of what she was because it suited me. And for me in my own identity, to erase part of what I was based on who I was talking to, or erasing or being asked to erase part of who I was based on who I was talking to or how I had to present. And that side of it too, with Cyprian, I think is an interesting side to explore, the notion that you can be more than one thing at once because you are still you.
Yeah.
People are able to manage, mother and sister and wife and employee or whatever it is. Right. You are still you. So if what you are is the mask and you don't know what's behind the mask, then you're going to feel a sense of loss when the mask leaves. But for those of us that Catholicism is the worldview, is the paradigm, is the cultural context, the calendar upon which we describe things, and it unifies us according to the great green, white, red, purple, that's something. But the Cyprian thing opens up an interesting dialogue and perspective with that. Justina, on the other hand, is obviously pure Christian and very, the heart of Cyprian in that way. And then they inspire their third to be, what has happened here at this space? Oh, you're dying too. Well, he's the student of them, but he only trained for a day. What? Or sometimes he was already training with them, depending on the lore you hear. But I just think this idea of enacting in improv, right? You don't say no, but say yes and. So with the Christo conjure, Christo magic things that are happening, it's a very yes and attitude. And the Catholicism lends itself perfectly to that. The concept of sacramentals and what power you might have from being properly confirmed in the church. All that is fascinating to me. Moving on from there of how does the dragon shit when it doesn't have a butthole?
Where? Where did that come from? I mean, I know you're trying to move it towards Cauda, but you might need to explain that dragon a little more.
Head before I made the comment of things. Like, concepts of identity and things like that, of like we have a sign that is defined by what it is lacking.
Well, it is when, well, that's an interesting mark of good and bad, right? You get Cauda Draconis, the dragon's head, being all those like big yeses, and how much we favor yes as an affirmative as therefore good, and that Cauda is bad news bear. It is the firm no, and more than that, when it's describing a bunch of conditions, it's not just no and whatever no might mean in that context. It's bad, it's trouble, it's perplexity, it's scandals, calumnies, it's destruction, it's crossings, it's threats, it's violence.
There is no Hire in Ogunda. It is always destruction. You can guide destruction, but destruction will happen.
Right.
Which is the corresponding Odu, by the way.
Yeah. Of course. So I think it's interesting that it is common to talk about the South Node and Cauda Draconis as headless, because the other one is the head. But I think it's interesting to look at what an actual tail is as well. Like I like that notion of it as headless medicine, and as caput as the severed head, the oracle, and all that kind of business. So I think it's cool to talk about Cauda as the headless one, but I also think it's interesting that's not, that's technically not its name. Is the tail everything that isn't the head? Where is the self? Like that, those kinds of stuff gets interesting to me. Is the tail the wake of that which is left, dragged across a landscape, by this hulking, scaly, fire-breathing beast?
Tail the part that is after the poop hole, Al.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Teach you anything?
The shitty end of the stick. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Which is actually not much, right? So it's interesting because you think the snake is all tail, but it's actually very little tail at the end. A lot of digestive tract. But I also think it's interesting that the glyphs themselves depict an absence of the thing there to mark it in some way.
Yeah. I mean, you can talk about if it's 2 1 1 1 from the top to the bottom like that. I have seen that's Cauda Draconis of the 2 on the fire line in the first line as the open jaws, right? But then what is the
is it a bidented tail, bifurcated tail? Like what is
right? Yeah.
You dragon tail possum penises? Like what's going on?
There are a lot of lizards have those 2 peni.
Pensies is a correct plural.
Okay.
Like menses, but with a P.
So Cauda has this quality of, in the first it said that it always produces much mischief and trouble, and that can be framed as a perplexity of body. So in terms of the diseases, a perplexity of mind, of being in the wrong mind for something. It can mean outside influences, scandals. It's said to be generally good for nothing but ruins, and specifically burnings of countries by wars and treason as well. So bad, in fact, that it's another one of those figures that a lot of traditional geomancers didn't read if it came up as the figure in the first house, if it came up as the first figure of a reading. And there are various things that the chart must be broken, that you can't ask that question again, that you have to wait at least an hour, which is one of the other ones that I find interesting, is that it's expressly said in a couple of these manuals that you can't read now. And what does that mean in terms of when can I try again? Sometimes it's an hour. But other geomancers said, no, it's fine. You can read it. You can keep reading that chart. But it's always bad. Sometimes it's bad in the typical way that one would expect when it turns up in that house. So in the 5th, the house of pleasures and delights, it's said to destroy the querent's pleasures and delights. So it's a figure of corruption. In the 8th, when it's already about the manner of death, it threatens a violent death, especially if the figures of the moon and the sun, of Vir and Populus and Fortuna Major and Fortuna Minor are present or afflicted by the malefics themselves as well. In the 9th, it's said to be it's said to produce amongst either an atheist or a skeptic or a pestilent heretic. And so it's not just the notion of your bio. How very dare you, sir. Pestilent heretic is a pretty good thing to have on a CV, to be honest.
That is a fantastic band name.
Right. Yeah.
Or like a track name.
Oh, it's definitely like a sludge, like metal band, like stoner rock kind of thing, isn't it? Yeah. It's that it's not just a quality of like no of a negative. It's like it feels a lot at the time reading these like it's the worst version of the thing that could happen. Then it's not just the lesser fortune; it's the worst fortune.
The visual that comes to mind for me is Ye Harryhausen. But when you cut off Medusa's head in all the movies, so this is the way it was in reality, I'm sure, the head is now controlled and you can control it.
Right.
You can petrify monsters. You have control of the head, but the body is writhing and ichor is falling out of it. Poison is falling out of it. And that's interesting that you cut off the head of a rattlesnake. The head is the dangerous part, but now you're controlling what was the poison, but the rest of that body is lashing around, doing something. And it's no longer static, where the head is no longer, it stops moving quickly, but the body keeps alive for a very long time. And there's something interesting to me with that, with this notion of the tail of the dragon and its more dangerous point of even its relationship in the corresponding Odu that we've talked about, of Cauda Draconis being Osa, which is quick, violent, sudden change, and Cauda Draconis being Ogunda, which is war and destruction and metal. It's Ogun's Odu. So it's a warrior Odu. There is something interesting in that the thing that is unpredictable, the writhing, the pain, the agony, is contained in the tail. And that the head is dangerous, but once the danger is over, it's controllable. Like, it could also be a quick change for the good. Snake didn't bite you, it lunged at you and you survived. Whatever you want to say, maybe it's not just escaping a bad fortune, but Cauda Draconis can actually be good fortune. And that side of it is very interesting. But I'm seeing the Medusa writhing along the ground in Clash of the Titans. And
yeah, I really like that. Yeah, the Hael's still trying to still thrashing and stuff. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
There's other accounts where it's said that if it's in the, even with the geomantics that say you can't judge it if it falls in the first, that say if it's in the second and passes to the fourth, that there are no certain judgments. And I love this phrasing, for the malice of the said figure. So again, I'm super into the idea of like the figures having personalities and objectives and things they're trying to do in the world. And so that idea of this isn't just a figure that points at, bad news or bad luck, but it's actively malicious. Like it wants to inflict evil, for want of a better term, pain, suffering, loss.
I mean, that does correspond a little bit with Ogunda in the sense that Ogunda is always destruction, but you can guide the destruction if you see it coming. And the metaphor of that always is, Ogun wields the machete and he's going to chop it, and you can direct him to clear the forest and clear a field, where if you aren't conscious of it, it will continue to manifest and he will plow right through that village and kill everyone in it. And the ability of metal to cut the skin for surgery or for warfare. And like that removal, the excising of things that you trample, that you create through destruction in this Odu. It is a tremendous possibility to go from something very frail to something very strong and centered, to go from timid and at war with the world to mastering yourself and being at peace in the world because you were at war with yourself. But you could also be at war with your own head in it, and therefore never and make anything accomplished in the world because you're destroying your progress before you start. So there's so many possibilities in it of what it is. I don't want to go into specific signs lest the Ultra Mafia come after me.
Well, that notion that violence can be directed inwards, that in a constructive way of tempering the steel on the iron on the anvil of the soul, or it can be in the self-violence as we do ourselves and undoing ourselves before we begin.
There's some interesting acknowledgments with Ogunda that, like, okay, Ogunda comes up for someone, it has to manifest. This is all Odu are like this, but Ogunda is such a prime example of this. It has to manifest. So the person's told they're violent, so they try and do some weird kind of like Delphic prophecy thing where they don't want to be around certain people, so they're forcing themselves to be in a meditative, peaceful state all the time. But you're using Ogun there to force yourself into it. That's not what it is either. So you're still fulfilling the thing. You're finally doing something. It's kind of like a principle in our common love of the 90s. Well, maybe you were reading it like a baby then. Our common love of chaos magic. But, the idea that a fanatic Christian can easily become a fanatic Muslim, can easily become a fanatic anything. The commonality is fanaticism. And here, violence is the common thing. That in order for the world to come into being, when Obatala breaks into this world from Aye and pierces, it is the violence of metal that pierces into this world, the violence of iron, sky iron, right there, ripping through the worlds. to allow passage of the spirits, the Orisha, from one realm to the other. And similarly, that enter the world in extreme violence. The ripping of the amniotic sac, the breaking of the water, that allows us to go in, and the mother goes into extreme pain in order to birth life. And Ogunda starts to hint at that, of what is necessary to excise the tumor, to expose your body to extreme danger in order to heal you. And I think about that with scarification, because that's contained in this Odu, and what the significance of different things are that allow passage of medicine between things. The lines that are carved in the face traditionally in Yoruba, or striped beads, or striped paint, or whatever it is, it's symbolically allowing passage between that, what should be a very solid surface. And that's fascinating to me.
Right. And in that sense of passage, it's also an Odu of Elegua, right?
Yeah, well, Elegua speaks in every Odu, so it's really hard to, but because of the relationship between Elegua and Ogunda, and Ogun is of course present in Ogunda, it has to be. But Elegua speaks in every Odu, so we can always work him in. Obatala and Elegua, always you can work them in. But I think it's a strong warrior Odu in general. If there's a war going on, and how do you prepare yourself for battle? How do you go into practice mode for fighting that you realize you don't have to fight your loved ones, or that if you're upset, that energy has to go somewhere. You don't want to take it home with you, be destructive. Or maybe you do, maybe you're careless with it. And maybe those people, when their emotions go, you're just everything, and you feel it. Ogunda as a marker, people feel it very intensely. Take things personally. Because the hammer, you got hit. Where does that reaction go? Well, the energy travels through you and goes somewhere else, and now it's in your hand. You've got to figure out how to wield it back.
Is there that sense of the those cycles of violence as it gets put sometimes, in terms of abusers are often folks who are abused, and the attendant conversations about responsibility and ethics?
I think there's something to it. I mean, even the pataking of old, I don't remember. It's told in different Odu, of course, because every house, every village will tell things in different Odu to illustrate what they're talking about at the time. The idea that Ogun lusted after his mother and raped his mother, and as punishment for himself, went to work in the forest 24/7. And part of this is like, okay, that punishment, is he just avoiding it? But he himself needs to keep busy to be productive. And what is he doing? He's raping the earth for metal too. Pulling metal out of the earth is a violent act, and then shaping it for the benefit of everybody else. So the technology is there to create weapons of war or weapons for farming. Still a weapon, you're attacking the earth. Waging war on the spirits and the soil in order to grow things.
So is it an Odu of, if we're talking about like Cyprian and counter magic, might it connote those kinds of activities of responding to the harm done to you in a constructive way, or not even in a constructive way, in an effective way?
I think what is important as far as that kind of magic with Ogunda you cannot be consumed by the gathering of things. You can't hoard for the sake of hoarding. You have to use that knowledge. You have to put it into practice. Knowing that you're a violent person is not the same as doing something about it. Forearmed is forewarned, but that is the thing why the Odu doesn't exist in a state of ire, even when it's in a state of ire. You must. It's a battle that's constant. So, I don't know, that side of it, as far as counter magic, it's interesting because it can't just be about things in your head. Like, you've got to put what you know into practice. And, I don't know, that side is difficult. You cannot live in a world of possibilities. The warrior must make the decision, or it's life or death for them or the village or whatever it is. You have to act now. You don't get to pontificate and meditate on it. And that side of it with counter magic is interesting, right? Somebody sends something to you, you recognize the sign. Great. If you know who it is, then you can do your aggressive thing, going and, doing a specific target. Just doing enough magic to protect yourself and your loved one. There's something there in each Odu like that, I'm sure. But just Ogunda means medicine, right? It can be the iron fence that protects you too.
I wonder about this in terms of Cauda, because there are definitely figures that crop up where, depending on the nature of the question you've asked, if it's will I overcome my enemy, and you get Fortuna Major in the 12th, then yes, you will. But if you ask, is my enemy strong, then Fortuna Major in the 12th is going to mean yes, the enemy is like, that's your enemy's fortune, you know? It depends who it is referring to. Whereas you don't get that so much in Cauda. It isn't that you ask, is my enemy strong? There will be disaster and enmity, right? If it's turning up in the 12th, potentially for everyone. You know, it seems to have that kind of area of effect thing.
Yeah. I think it's just that Ogunda itself means there's war. There's conflict. And you must acknowledge it. Because denial means you're going to die. You're going to suffer the consequences of it either way. And so you have to find the things that cause conflict in you, the things that agitate you and take you away from being prepared to go to battle, and remove them. You can't travel heavy into war. So that side of it, when Ogunda falls, like, okay, this person lives in a state of conflict.
And so clarity becomes all the more important.
Yeah, and there's all those different sides of what conflict is. Could it be physical conflict? Yes. Could it be that you have you're not keeping your eye on the prize? You're not keeping your focus? Are you doing too much? Are you doing too little? Are you lying to yourself that it's something that you want? All of those possibilities exist there, but there is conflict first and foremost. You know, the idea that you might be not the concept, the idea that, you know, you talk too much. It's not necessarily about talking too much. It's about you don't talk at the right times. You know, not you, Al, but that's why the British one does work better. But then there's like that subtlety of like, well, when one wants to go to the supermarket with one mother, we can. And you're like, to just say like, are you ready yet? Because I want to go. But the concept of just, again, it has to manifest. And you can vacillate on something all you want, but it's need to move forward. Ogunda is the like, shit or get off the pot, Odu. And it's definitely like a run. Like, you got to do this. And they were like, this is hard.
The idea that a choice is itself a kind of violence against that which is not chosen. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, but it's also, fuck the relative thing of it's a choice. It's a choice against you. It's violence against you. By not making a choice, you are violently destroying your potential and wasting time. It's not just a violence against the other choice. That happens. We have to kill options off. We have to have a process of narrowing down. But what is its effect on you ultimately? That's the kicker. You know, you can be deciding whether or not you're going to have a red or a blue ice cream cone and the bus hits you because you were doing that in the crosswalk and not present. That's true too. The prevalence of violent metal colliding with metal. And metal people can be melted down and reused. So the knife doesn't know it's violent. There's a little bit of you knew what I was and you picked me up in this appropriate thing for anything Draconis, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we've hit on everything. Well, I mean, we've touched on them. We've not, you know, as you said, we're not attempting to do the authoritative take on all of these things, but we've definitely discussed them. And I think those are all things from the idea of, and ending on this, the meditation on violence is useful, I think, in terms of looking at Cyprian not through rose-tinted glasses of this, such a powerful and good version of paganism, and corrupted by evil, restrictive Christianity. Do it, you know, a move from unethical practice to an ethical practice, one might even say, if we were putting it like that, or to combine them and to be able to heal and harm. But in doing so, needing to profoundly meditate on violence and responsibility and choice and action.
And just it's very easy to be violent when you are unopposed. And that whole notion of you can barrel forward with your demon army, but you'll meet resistance at some point. And what do you do when you do? You know, if you are not paying attention, you know, running towards the enemy army is what you're supposed to do with an army. Running towards a brick wall, not necessarily. But they're equally violent expressions.
Right. Well, it has been a pleasure, as always. And hopefully this will be thoroughly listenable and appropriate offering for Cyprianmas and Justinamas.
I just want mice named that. But yes, no, lovely. And it's a show that's been a long time coming just because it's been a passion of ours, obviously. If you have not checked out Cyprian Old World, please do through Revelor Press. This is an anthology of articles by different people, including Al and Afterward by myself and Jake Stratton Kent and others, focusing on Cyprian's places in the Old World. You know, they're we're hoping to move forward with that. But we also have the immaterial book of Saint Cyprian.
Oh, yeah. A fantastic take on the book itself and the myths about the book keyed to particular Iberian landscapes and features. A fantastic text.
I don't a list of things in the notes, of course. You know, I imagine that people will be listening to this on the day, but also in the future for anyone that finds this episode. Just we are at a hugely fortuitous time as far as Cyprianic literature in English. It used to be a thing that you had to read Spanish or Portuguese, or perhaps one of the Swedish black books that is attributed to Saint Cyprian. But again, those collections of folk magic have less to do with Saint Cyprian and more are just in the vein of Cyprianic book.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the material, we haven't even gone into a lot of the Brazilian conceptions and things like that. And that's just a fascinating thing for me. The lore around Pai Cipriano and things like that, and how he used the book of Saint Cyprian in order to right the wrongs attributed to or given that his people had to suffer through when using magic in that way for peace. You know, declaring war on people in order to make peace. The army makes peace. It does not keep it. There's a difference. I always find that fascinating from my brother who was a colonel. Anyway, no, I think the boiling pot of sorcery that invites a third to come join them in the purgatory of the afterlife.
Room for one more.
Yeah, there's always room for one more in hell. And hell, you know, and as far as for me, you know, this we make of a hell our life or a heaven. And, you know, this kind of pseudo Gnostic interpretation of things is Cyprian grants agency, grants transmission in written form of magic. And this is lovely. But, you know, for everyone who holds him dear, everyone who holds him afar, for everyone who would like to know him better, for those who would like to forget, perhaps just don't, you know, I don't know, do some heavy drugs now so you forget this episode. But, you know, he will continue to guide those he guides. If we can all temper those he guides with a little bit of humor, that would be good, perhaps. Non-warfare at all times in a Libre AF world. But Justina's simplicity of, no, this is who I am, and I can reject anything if I truly believe in the power of my Jesus, you know, and everybody's Jesus may be a little bit different.
Right. The antidote of all poisons, which is occasionally,
which is
referred to at least by you.
Yeah. So this I adore. But, you know, I hope everyone continues to dive into them, and that I like that we're in a time where it's kind of died out a little bit. The fad is a little bit gone, but that it keeps on getting rekindled by more people bringing up and publishing things and publishing good short articles or talking about certain things.
Right.
Now the study can begin, because they're the people that are doing it and really devoting themselves to this saint, that once we get past its conflation with the Cyprian of Carthage that we talked about and the lack of Justina and things like that, then we can start to look at, you know, what is it like to work with a saint, not just to worship one, not just to call on one when 911 occurrences happen.
And especially as a magician saint, you know, giving us reflection on patronage itself, of not just, as we rail against a lot, the idea of picking a saint off the shelf because it's the one for that kind of work. But rather of the patron of all your magic, of who you go to for everything, and first, probably, you know, who oversees the whole endeavor of even doing this, of even being a magician with one arm raised and one lowered.
Well, I think it's interesting to just, I mean, I'm going to end this program if I keep talking. Just a patron saint and how quickly that's become like ideas of lists in people's heads, when there's no official list of patron saints in that way. Like, you know, Patrick is a magician. Bridget was a magician. Talking stuff that we talked about, and, you know, as it was, many magician saints. It's just that Cyprian retains that lore because of the book, right? The famed books and the kind of Beauty of the Beast story that is eternal and timeless out of that. So, may all your saints be necromantic beasts, and all of your beauties be lily daggers of antidotes and something.
May the cauldron be stirred to bring the best to the boil.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And we will reconvene soon for another October episode. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone.